In the dimly lit chambers of the Palazzo Vecchio, where shadows danced across worn stone walls and the weight of centuries pressed down like an unforgiving judge, Niccolo Machiavelli learnt the most profound truth of human existence. It was not in the grand halls of power, nor in the company of princes and kings that this revelation came to him. Instead, it emerged from the depths of his own suffering, crystallizing in those dark hours when fortune had stripped him of everything he held dear: his position, his reputation, his very sense of self. The year was 1513, and Machiavelli found himself imprisoned, tortured, and cast into the political wilderness that would define the remainder of his days. Yet it was precisely in this crucible of agony that he discovered what he would later call the supreme alchemy of human transformation: the ability to transmute suffering into unbreakable strength, to forge from the fires of adversity a self so resilient that no external force could ever again reduce it to ash. This is not merely the story of one man's journey through darkness, but a blueprint for total reinvention that has echoed through the centuries, influencing leaders, artists, philosophers, and ordinary individuals who dared to embrace their pain as the raw material for their rebirth. For Machiavelli understood what modern psychology would later confirm, that the individual who learns to destroy his weak self, to strip away every illusion and comfortable lie that keeps him bound to mediocrity, becomes genuinely invulnerable to the machinations of others. The wisdom contained within these pages is dangerous because it is true. It demands nothing less than the complete dismantling of one's former identity and the conscious construction of something infinitely more powerful. It asks us to see suffering not as an enemy to be avoided, but as a teacher to be embraced, a sculptor's tool that can carve away everything unnecessary until only the essential remains. Part 1. The Architecture of Adversity. The messenger arrived at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat and his eyes bearing the weight of terrible news. Machiavelli received the dispatch in his study, surrounded by the books and manuscripts that had been his constant companions during 14 years of faithful service to the Florentine Republic. The words on the parchment were simple, devastating, and final. The Medici had returned to power, and he was to be immediately stripped of all positions, banned from the city, and placed under suspicion of conspiracy. In that moment, as the morning light filtered through the narrow windows and illuminated the dust motes that seemed to dance in mockery of his sudden fall from grace, Machiavelli experienced what he would later describe as the first gift of adversity: absolute clarity. The comfortable illusions that had sustained him for decades crumbled instantly. His belief in loyalty being rewarded, in merit being recognized, in the fundamental fairness of political life, all of these cherished notions dissolved like salt in water. The weak man, faced with such a reversal, seeks immediately to restore what was lost, to return to the familiar patterns that provided security and meaning. He pleads, he bargains, he clings desperately to the remnants of his former identity like a drowning man grasping at debris. But Machiavelli, even in those first hours of his destruction, recognized something profound. What was being taken from him was not his strength, but his weakness. Every comfortable assumption, every unexamined belief, every aspect of his identity that depended upon external validation was being stripped away by forces beyond his control. This recognition marked the beginning of what he would call the great work, the deliberate and systematic destruction of the weak self that had made him vulnerable to fortune's reversals in the first place. For he understood that the man who waits for life to destroy his weaknesses will be destroyed along with them. Only the individual who takes up this task himself, who becomes the architect of his own dissolution and reconstruction, can emerge from the process stronger than before. The months that followed his disgrace were filled with privation and humiliation. Former colleagues crossed the street to avoid him, his financial resources dwindled, and even his family looked upon him with the mixture of pity and embarrassment reserved for those who have fallen from grace. But Machiavelli had begun to see these external circumstances as secondary to the real battle taking place within his own consciousness. Each day brought new opportunities to identify and eliminate the mental habits, emotional patterns, and psychological dependencies that had made him weak. He began with his need for approval, that most insidious of weaknesses, that causes men to shape their actions according to the expectations of others rather than the demands of truth and effectiveness. In his comfortable years as a civil servant, he had unconsciously crafted his words and deeds to please his superiors, to maintain his standing in society, to preserve the good opinion of his peers. Now, with all of these external sources of validation removed, He was forced to confront the hollow center where his authentic self should have been. The process was excruciating. Each day brought fresh waves of anxiety, self-doubt, and despair as he peeled away layer after layer of constructed identity. He discovered that much of what he had considered his personality was merely a collection of adaptive responses to social pressures, survival mechanisms that had served him well in his rise to power, but had also made him dependent on circumstances remaining favorable. When those circumstances changed, as they inevitably do, he found himself unprepared and vulnerable. But in this vulnerability, Machiavelli began to discover something remarkable: a core of being that existed independent of external circumstances, a foundation of self that could not be touched by the fluctuations of fortune. This was not the ego-driven personality he had been so proud of, with its need for recognition and its fear of failure. This was something deeper and more enduring. What he came to call the essential self, the irreducible core of consciousness and will that exists prior to and independent of all social conditioning. The cultivation of this essential self became his primary occupation. Each morning, in the silence before dawn, he would engage in what he called the examination, a ruthless inventory of his thoughts, emotions, and reactions from the previous day. Where had he acted from strength and where from weakness? Where had he been driven by fear and where by genuine understanding? Where had he allowed external circumstances to dictate his internal state? And where had he maintained sovereignty over his own experience? This daily practice revealed to him the intricate architecture of human weakness, the complex web of unconscious beliefs, inherited assumptions, and unexamined fears that determine most people's behavior. He began to see how suffering, rather than being simply a negative experience to be endured, was actually life's most effective teacher, stripping away illusions and forcing individuals to confront the truth about themselves and their situation. The weak man, Machiavelli observed, suffers without learning. He experiences pain but derives no wisdom from it, allowing the same patterns to repeat endlessly. He may even take pride in his capacity to endure, mistaking passive acceptance for strength. The true strength, he realized, comes not from enduring suffering but from transforming it, from using adversity as raw material for the construction of a more resilient and capable self. This transformation requires what Machiavelli termed conscious destruction, the deliberate dismantling of aspects of personality and identity that serve no useful purpose or that create unnecessary vulnerability. It is not enough to wait for life to do this work. One must become an active participant in one's own reconstruction, approaching the task with the same methodical precision that a master craftsman brings to his work. The first stage of this process involves developing what he called the observer's eye, the ability to watch one's own thoughts and reactions with complete objectivity, as if observing a stranger. This requires considerable practice and discipline, as most people are so identified with their mental and emotional patterns that they cannot see them clearly. But once this capacity is developed, it becomes possible to identify the specific beliefs and habits that create weakness and vulnerability. Machiavelli discovered that many of his deepest fears were based on assumptions that had never been tested. His terror of poverty, for instance, was largely theoretical. He had never actually experienced genuine material hardship. His anxiety about social rejection was similarly unfounded, based more on imagination than reality. By deliberately exposing himself to these feared experiences, by choosing to face them voluntarily, rather than having them imposed upon him by circumstance, he found that they lost much of their power over him. This process of voluntary exposure to difficulty became central to his method of self-strengthening. Rather than seeking comfort and security, he began actively seeking challenges that would test and develop his capabilities. He subjected himself to physical hardship, intellectual challenges, and social isolation, not out of masochism but as a form of training. Just as a soldier prepares for battle by subjecting himself to increasingly difficult exercises, Machiavelli prepared for life by deliberately confronting the very experiences he had previously sought to avoid. The results were remarkable. As his tolerance for discomfort increased, his overall resilience grew. As his need for external validation decreased, his capacity for independent judgment expanded. As his fear of loss diminished, his willingness to take necessary risks increased. He was becoming, in his own words, ungovernable by fortune, a man whose internal state remained stable regardless of external circumstances. This stability was not the rigid inflexibility of the fanatic, but the fluid adaptability of the master. Because he was no longer dependent on any particular outcome for his sense of self-worth, He could respond to changing circumstances with complete pragmatism. Because he was no longer driven by unconscious fears and desires, he could see situations clearly and act effectively. Because he had voluntarily destroyed his weak self, nothing external could destroy him. The transformation was not merely psychological, but manifested in every aspect of his life. His writing, previously competent but unremarkable, began to display a clarity and power that would influence political thought for centuries. His relationships, no longer based on mutual dependencies and unspoken bargains, became more honest and satisfying. His decision-making, freed from the distortions of fear and wishful thinking, became devastatingly effective. But perhaps most importantly, he had discovered a source of strength that was truly his own, not borrowed from institutions or relationships or circumstances, but generated from within through the conscious cultivation of his essential nature. This strength was renewable because it was based not on favorable conditions, but on his capacity to transform unfavorable ones. It was unassailable because it existed independent of external validation. It was inexhaustible because it grew stronger with use rather than weaker. As the first phase of his transformation neared completion, Machiavelli began to understand that suffering had indeed been his greatest teacher, not because it had ennobled him through passive endurance, but because it had forced him to develop capabilities he never knew he possessed. The weak self that had been so concerned with comfort and security had been replaced by something far more valuable, a core of being that could not be compromised, corrupted, or destroyed by any external force. This realization marked the end of the first stage of his journey and the beginning of the second. The conscious construction of a new identity based not on social expectations or inherited patterns, but on a clear understanding of his own nature and the demands of reality. The man who had entered this process as a conventional civil servant, dependent on external circumstances for his sense of worth and direction, was ready to emerge as something entirely different, a force of nature unto himself. Part 2. The Forge of Character. The autumn rains had turned the roads around Sant'Andrea in Percasina into ribbons of mud, and Machiavelli's exile from Florence felt heavier with each passing day. Yet it was during these months of isolation, when the outer world had seemingly abandoned him, that he began the most crucial work of his life, not the writing of treatises or letters to princes, but the deliberate forging of an unbreakable character from the raw materials of his suffering. In the small farmhouse that had become both his prison and his laboratory, Machiavelli established what he called the workshop of necessity, a systematic approach to transforming weakness into strength that would become the foundation for all meaningful change. The process began with a deceptively simple recognition. That character, like steel, must be heated, hammered, and cooled repeatedly before it achieves its final form. The comfortable life he had known before his fall had been, in retrospect, a form of softness that had prevented him from discovering what he was truly capable of becoming. Each morning, as the first light crept across the Tuscan hills, he would rise before dawn to engage in what he privately called the Great Accounting, a merciless examination of every aspect of his being that remained tainted by weakness. This was not the gentle self-reflection advocated by philosophers who had never faced genuine adversity, but a surgical procedure performed without anesthesia. He dissected his fears with the precision of an anatomist, traced the roots of his insecurities to their source, and identified every mental habit that served to protect him from reality rather than helping him to engage with it more effectively. The first target of this systematic destruction was his attachment to the opinions of others. Machiavelli had always prided himself on being a man of the people, someone who understood the common sentiment and could navigate the complex web of social relationships that defined political life. But he now recognized this sensitivity to public opinion as a form of slavery, one that made him perpetually reactive to forces beyond his control and prevented him from developing the independent judgment essential to true leadership. The process of freeing himself from this dependency was more difficult than he had anticipated. For decades, his sense of self-worth had been intimately connected to his reputation, his standing in society, his ability to win approval and avoid criticism. Without these external sources of validation, he felt initially like a ship without an anchor, drifting in an ocean of uncertainty. But gradually, as he persisted in his practice of inner examination, he began to discover something remarkable. A voice within himself that spoke with absolute clarity and authority about what was true and what was false, what was wise and what was foolish, what was necessary and what was merely conventional. This inner voice, which he came to call the counselor of truth, had always been present but had been drowned out by the cacophony of social expectations and fear-based thinking. Now, in the silence of his exile, he could finally hear it clearly. It told him things that were often uncomfortable, sometimes painful, but always useful. It revealed the self-serving nature of many of his previous beliefs, the cowardice masked as prudence in many of his past decisions, the ways in which his desire to be liked had prevented him from being genuinely helpful to those he served. As this inner voice grew stronger, Machiavelli found his external circumstances becoming almost irrelevant to his sense of well-being. The opinions of others, which had once determined his mood and shaped his actions, became merely data points to be considered along with all other available information. He was developing what he called sovereign judgment, the ability to evaluate situations and make decisions based purely on their merits rather than on their likely reception by various audiences. This newfound independence brought with it a profound sense of liberation, but also a daunting responsibility. No longer could he blame his failures on circumstances or other people. No longer could he excuse his mistakes as the inevitable result of political necessity or social pressure. Every choice was now clearly his own, and every consequence had to be owned completely. This accountability was initially terrifying, but it proved to be the foundation of genuine strength. The second phase of his transformation focused on what he termed the cultivation of essential qualities, the systematic development of characteristics that would serve him regardless of external circumstances. Chief among these was the capacity for sustained attention, the ability to focus his mind completely on whatever task demanded his energy, without being distracted by anxieties about the past or worries about the future. This mental discipline required months of training. Machiavelli would begin each day by selecting a single problem or question and committing to think about nothing else until he had either solved it or reached the limits of what could be understood with available information. Initially, his mind would wander constantly, pulled away by worries about his reputation, fantasies about revenge against his enemies, or simple boredom with the task at hand. But gradually, through persistent practice, he developed the ability to sustain focused attention for hours at a time. The results were extraordinary. Problems that had seemed intractable when approached with a scattered mind yielded readily to sustained analysis. Complex political situations became clear when examined without the interference of wishful thinking or emotional reactivity. He began to see patterns and connections that had previously escaped his notice, to understand the deeper forces that shaped events rather than being distracted by their surface manifestations. This enhanced capacity for analysis revealed to him another crucial weakness that needed to be addressed: his tendency toward emotional reactivity. In his previous life, he had prided himself on his passion, his ability to be moved by events and to respond with appropriate feeling. But he now recognized that much of what he had called passion was actually compulsion, automatic emotional responses that served to discharge psychological tension rather than to accomplish anything useful. The cultivation of emotional mastery became his next great undertaking. This did not mean suppressing his emotions or becoming coldly indifferent to events around him. Rather, it meant developing the ability to feel deeply without being controlled by those feelings, to maintain clarity of thought and effectiveness of action regardless of his internal emotional state. The method he developed was characteristically practical. Whenever he noticed himself being gripped by a strong emotion, anger, fear, sadness, or even excessive joy, he would immediately stop whatever he was doing and examine the feeling with the same objective curiosity he would bring to studying a natural phenomenon. What had triggered this emotion? What thoughts were associated with it? What physical sensations accompanied it? What actions was it prompting him to take or avoid? Through this process of examination, he discovered that emotions, while powerful, were not mysterious or uncontrollable forces. They followed predictable patterns, arose from identifiable causes, and could be influenced through changes in thinking and behavior. More importantly, he learned that the most destructive emotions were almost always based on some form of self-deception, unrealistic expectations, unfounded fears, or misinterpretations of events. As his emotional mastery developed, Machiavelli found that he could maintain effectiveness even in highly charged situations. Criticism that would once have sent him into spirals of self-doubt now provided useful information about how others perceived his actions. Setbacks that would have previously triggered despair or rage became simply data points in a larger strategic picture. Success, which had once filled him with a pride that made him careless, now brought only the satisfaction of having acted skillfully according to his principles. This emotional equilibrium provided the foundation for the development of what he considered the most important quality of all, the ability to act from principle rather than from impulse or circumstance. During his years as a civil servant, he had prided himself on his flexibility, his ability to adapt his position to whatever the political winds demanded. He had seen this as pragmatism, but he now understood it as a form of moral cowardice that had prevented him from developing any consistent philosophy of action. The creation of a personal code of principles was perhaps the most challenging aspect of his transformation. It required him to decide, once and for all, what he truly believed about human nature, about the proper relationship between individuals and society, about the use of power and the meaning of justice. These were not merely intellectual exercises, but practical decisions that would determine how he conducted himself for the rest of his life. The principles he eventually settled upon were stark in their simplicity and unwavering in their application. First, he would always act according to his best understanding of reality, rather than according to how he wished things were. Second, he would never sacrifice long-term effectiveness for short-term comfort or approval. Third, he would take complete responsibility for the consequences of his actions rather than seeking to blame others when things went wrong. Fourth, he would never pretend to be something he was not, whether to gain advantage or to avoid conflict. These principles, once adopted, transformed every aspect of his daily existence. Decisions that had once required lengthy deliberation became immediately clear when evaluated against his established standards. Relationships that had been based on mutual deception or convenience either deepened into genuine friendship or ended cleanly. His writing, freed from the need to please various audiences or advance particular agendas, began to exhibit the devastating clarity that would make it immortal. But perhaps most importantly, the establishment of fixed principles provided him with an unshakable foundation that remained constant regardless of external circumstances. No longer was he at the mercy of changing political winds or shifting social fashions. No longer did he need to reinvent himself to meet the expectations of each new situation. He had become, in his own phrase, a law unto himself. Not in the sense of being above morality, but in the sense of having internalized a code of conduct that required no external enforcement. This internal consistency created what Machiavelli called the fortress of self, a psychological structure that could not be penetrated or destroyed by external forces because it was based on principles rather than circumstances, on understanding rather than hope, on deliberate choice rather than unconscious reaction. From this fortress, he could engage with the world fully while remaining fundamentally untouchable. The transformation was now entering its final phase. The weak man who had entered this process, dependent on others for validation, driven by unconscious fears and desires, reactive to circumstances beyond his control, had been systematically dismantled and replaced with something entirely different. What remained was to test this new construction against the challenges of the real world, to discover whether theoretical strength could translate into practical effectiveness. As winter gave way to spring in the Tuscan countryside, Machiavelli prepared to re-enter the world of human affairs, not as a supplicant seeking restoration to his former position, but as a transformed being carrying knowledge that could reshape the very foundations of how men understood power, politics, and the possibilities of human nature. The forge had done its work. Now it was time to discover what the man who had emerged from it was truly capable of achieving. Part 3. The Indestructible Self. The letter arrived on a morning when the mist hung low over the valley, carrying with it an opportunity that would test everything Machiavelli had built within himself during his years of exile and transformation. Giuliano de' Medici, brother to the new Pope Leo X, had expressed interest in meeting with the former secretary, perhaps with a view toward employing his talents in service of the papal court. For the old Machiavelli, this would have been a moment of desperate hope, a chance to crawl back into the good graces of power and restore his former position. But the man who read this letter was fundamentally different from the one who had been cast into exile 5 years earlier. The transformation was complete, and with it had come a profound understanding. The man who has successfully destroyed his weak self becomes, in the truest sense, indestructible. Not because he is immune to loss or failure. No human being can claim such immunity, but because he no longer depends upon external circumstances for his sense of worth, purpose, or identity. He has become what Machiavelli termed the self-originating man, one who generates his own meaning, establishes his own values, and maintains his own counsel regardless of the chaos or clarity of the world around him. This indestructibility was not theoretical, but had been tested repeatedly during the years of his exile. There had been moments of profound despair when old friends crossed the street to avoid him, when former colleagues spoke of him with contempt, when his financial situation became so desperate that he was forced to sell family possessions to buy bread. In each of these situations, the weak man would have been crushed, would have begged for mercy, would have compromised his principles for the promise of relief. But Machiavelli found that the core self he had constructed remained unmoved by these external pressures. The secret lay in what he had learned to call the doctrine of essential independence, the recognition that true strength comes not from controlling circumstances, but from being fundamentally uncontrolled by them. This was not the stoic resignation that accepts whatever happens with passive indifference, nor was it the naive optimism that believes everything happens for the best. It was something far more practical and powerful. The ability to extract value from any situation, to learn from every experience, and to use whatever materials life provides for the ongoing project of self-development. This doctrine had allowed him to transform his exile from a punishment into an education, his disgrace from a defeat into an opportunity for reconstruction. Every humiliation had become a lesson in the irrelevance of reputation to genuine worth. Every material hardship had become training in the distinction between genuine need and manufactured desire. Every moment of isolation had become an opportunity to develop the internal resources that no external force could touch or diminish. The process had revealed to him the architecture of human weakness with scientific precision. He had observed that most men live in a state of what he called conditional existence, their happiness depending on favorable circumstances, their self-worth tied to external validation, their sense of security based on the illusion that they can control forces beyond their influence. This conditional existence made them perpetually vulnerable, always at risk of devastation when circumstances inevitably shifted in unfavorable directions. But the man who had learned to live from his essential nature operated according to entirely different principles. His happiness came from the satisfaction of acting according to his understanding rather than from achieving particular outcomes. His self-worth was based on his capacity to think clearly and act decisively rather than on the approval of others. His security came from his ability to adapt to changing circumstances rather than from the futile attempt to prevent change from occurring. This fundamental shift in orientation created what Machiavelli called the reversal of fortune's power. Instead of being a victim of circumstances, he had become their master, not by controlling them, which was impossible, but by developing the internal resources to transform whatever occurred into raw material for further development. Setbacks became opportunities to test and strengthen his principles. Criticism became information about how others perceived his actions. Success became confirmation that his methods were sound rather than reasons for complacency or pride. The practical applications of this transformation were immediately apparent in how he approached the opportunity presented by Giuliano de' Medici's interest. The old Machiavelli would have seen this as a chance for redemption, would have crafted his response to say whatever he thought the Medici wanted to hear, would have subordinated his authentic views to the requirements of political expediency. But the transformed man approached the situation with an entirely different strategy. He would present himself exactly as he was, with complete honesty about his views and capabilities. He would offer his services not as a supplicant grateful for any crumb of favor, but as a master craftsman confident in the value of his skills. He would make clear that his loyalty, if given, would be absolute and unwavering, but that it could not be purchased through appeals to his vanity or fears about his security. Most importantly, he would demonstrate through his very manner that he was no longer the same man who could be broken by political pressure or corrupted by promises of advancement. This approach required extraordinary courage because it risked immediate rejection. The safe path would have been to humble himself, to express gratitude for the opportunity, to carefully probe what was expected, and then provide exactly that. But Machiavelli had learned that safety itself was an illusion, that the attempt to secure favorable treatment through submission and manipulation was a form of slow-acting poison that inevitably destroyed the very qualities that made a man valuable in the first place. When the meeting finally took place in the ornate chambers of the Medici palace, the contrast between the old and new Machiavelli was immediately apparent to all present. Gone was the eager-to-please functionary who had once served the Republic with competent mediocrity. In his place stood a man of such evident self-possession and clarity of purpose that even his former enemies found themselves listening with unexpected respect to his analysis of political situations and recommendations for action. The conversation revealed another crucial aspect of his transformation: the development of what he called sovereign speech. the ability to communicate truth without regard for its likely reception. This was not the reckless honesty of the man who speaks his mind without considering consequences, but something far more sophisticated: the capacity to present reality in its most useful form, regardless of whether that reality was comfortable or threatening to his audience. When asked about the political situation in Florence, he did not provide the reassuring platitudes that officials typically offered to their superiors. Instead, he gave a precise analysis of the actual forces at work, the genuine challenges facing the Medici administration, and the hard choices that would need to be made if they were to govern effectively rather than merely maintain the appearance of control. When questioned about his own loyalty, he did not offer flowery declarations of devotion, but explained clearly the principles that would guide his actions and the conditions under which he could serve with genuine effectiveness. This directness had a remarkable effect on his audience. They found themselves in the presence of someone who seemed to have no agenda beyond the clear presentation of reality, no ulterior motives beyond the desire to be useful in accordance with his genuine capabilities. This was so unusual in the world of Renaissance politics that it created its own form of power, the authority that comes from being the only person in the room who is not trying to manipulate the outcome for personal advantage. The meeting concluded with an offer of employment, but more importantly, it confirmed for Machiavelli that his transformation had achieved its intended goal. He was no longer dependent on the approval of others for his sense of worth. He was no longer driven by unconscious fears or desires that could be exploited by those who wished to control him. He was no longer the weak man who could be destroyed by external forces because he had already destroyed that man himself and replaced him with something infinitely more resilient. The months that followed brought a series of tests that would have broken his former self completely. Political alliances shifted, patrons withdrew their support, promises were broken, and he found himself once again facing the prospect of poverty and obscurity. But instead of the despair and frantic maneuvering that would have characterized his previous responses to such reversals, he met each challenge with the calm effectiveness of a master craftsman solving familiar problems. Each setback became an opportunity to demonstrate the principles he had developed. When former allies turned against him, he examined their motives with scientific curiosity rather than taking their betrayal as a personal injury. When financial pressures mounted, he found creative solutions that maintained his independence rather than seeking relief through compromise of his integrity. When his ideas were ignored or dismissed, he continued to develop them with the patience of a man who understood that truth has its own timeline and does not depend on immediate recognition for its validity. This consistency of response, regardless of external circumstances, created what Machiavelli recognized as the ultimate form of strength: the power to influence others not through manipulation or coercion, but through the simple example of what a human being becomes when he is no longer driven by fear or corrupted by the desire for approval. People began to seek his counsel not because of his official position, he held none, but because of the evident clarity of his thinking and the reliability of his character. The writings that emerged from this period reflected this transformation completely. The Prince, which would become his most famous work, was not the product of a man seeking to curry favor with potential patrons, but the distillation of hard-won wisdom by someone who had learned to see political reality with devastating clarity. The discourses revealed a thinker who had transcended the conventional categories of his time and developed genuinely original insights into the nature of power, governance, and human motivation. These works possessed a quality that immediate recognized but few could explain. They seemed to speak from a place of absolute authority that had nothing to do with the author's social position or official credentials. They carried the unmistakable ring of truth discovered through direct experience rather than inherited through tradition or borrowed from books. They demonstrated what Machiavelli had always suspected but only now fully understood: that genuine knowledge comes not from comfort and security, but from the willingness to face reality in its rawest form and extract wisdom from the encounter. As his reputation as a thinker and advisor grew, Machiavelli found himself in the curious position of wielding more influence as an outsider than he had ever possessed as an insider. Kings and princes sought his advice not because they had to, but because they recognized the value of counsel that came uncontaminated by personal agenda or fear of consequences. His ideas spread throughout Europe, not through official channels, but through the simple power of truth to propagate itself when expressed with sufficient clarity and conviction. This influence, however, never corrupted him because it was not based on his need for external validation. He had learned the crucial distinction between impact and importance. Impact was what he could achieve in the world through skillful action, while importance was something he possessed inherently as a conscious being, capable of understanding and choice. The old Machiavelli had confused these two things, believing that his importance as a human being depended on his ability to achieve impact in the political sphere. The transformed man understood that his importance was constant and unassailable, while his impact was simply the natural expression of his developed capabilities applied to whatever circumstances presented themselves. This understanding freed him to engage fully with the world while remaining fundamentally detached from its outcomes. He could work tirelessly for causes he believed in without being devastated if they failed. He could offer his best thinking and effort without requiring gratitude or recognition. He could face opposition and criticism without being deflected from his purpose. He had become, in the deepest sense, ungovernable by external forces because he had learned to govern himself according to principles derived from his own understanding, rather than imposed by circumstance or inherited from tradition. The man who had begun this journey as a conventional civil servant, dependent on external validation and driven by unconscious fears, had emerged as something entirely different, a force of nature disguised as a human being, capable of generating his own meaning and direction regardless of the chaos or indifference of the world around him. He had discovered what few men ever learn, that the individual who destroys his weak self becomes genuinely indestructible because he no longer has anything essential that can be taken from him by external forces. This was the final gift of suffering, not the dubious consolation that pain ennobles or that everything happens for a reason, but the practical knowledge that adversity, when approached with the proper understanding, becomes the most reliable means of developing the internal resources that make a human being truly strong. The weak man seeks to avoid suffering and is therefore forever vulnerable to it. The strong man learns to transform suffering into strength and therefore becomes immune to its destructive power. In his final years, as Machiavelli reflected on the journey that had taken him from the heights of conventional success to the depths of disgrace and finally to a form of mastery that transcended both, he understood that he had discovered something of immense value, not just for himself but for anyone willing to undertake the difficult work of conscious transformation. The method was brutal in its honesty and demanding in its requirements, but it was also reliable in its results. The man who could face himself without illusion, who could accept responsibility without excuse, who could act from principle without regard for consequence, who could learn from failure without being destroyed by it. Such a man became genuinely free in a world where most people live as slaves to their unconscious patterns and unexamined fears. He had found the secret of secrets, that true strength comes not from building walls against adversity, but from developing the internal resources to transform adversity into opportunity. This was Machiavelli's ultimate legacy, more valuable than any of his political insights or strategic recommendations. The demonstration that human beings are capable of conscious evolution, that it is possible to transcend the limitations imposed by circumstance and conditioning, and that the individual who undertakes this transformation becomes not just stronger, but fundamentally different in kind from those who remain trapped in patterns of reactive weakness. The path he had discovered was not for everyone. It required a level of honesty and courage that few possess. But for those willing to pay the price, it offered something precious beyond measure, the possibility of becoming genuinely indestructible, not through the accumulation of external protections, but through the development of an internal core that could not be touched by any external force. In a world where most strength is borrowed and therefore temporary, he had found the secret of strength that is generated from within and therefore permanent. The man who destroys his weak self, as Machiavelli had proven through his own transformation, cannot be destroyed by others because he has already done the hardest work himself. What remains is not a diminished version of what he once was, but something entirely new, a self-originating force that moves through the world according to its own understanding, serves its own highest principles, and remains forever beyond the reach of those who would seek to control it through the manipulation of fear and desire. This was the true science of power that Machiavelli had discovered, not the external techniques of political manipulation that most associated with his name, but the internal alchemy that transforms suffering into strength, weakness into resilience, and ordinary human consciousness into something approaching the divine. It was a knowledge that once gained could never be lost, a strength that once developed could never be diminished, a form of mastery that made its possessor genuinely free in a world where freedom was the rarest of commodities. In the end, this was what made Machiavelli not just a political theorist, but a teacher of human possibility. He had demonstrated through his own example that conscious transformation was not just possible, but practical. Not just desirable, but necessary for anyone who wished to live as a human being rather than as a sophisticated animal driven by unconscious programming. The weak man he had once been was gone forever, destroyed by his own hand. What remained would endure as long as human beings sought to understand the deepest secrets of their own nature and the highest possibilities of their existence.